Pete Kadens is a serial entrepreneur and passionate philanthropist dedicated to creating opportunities for those in need. After founding and leading 2 industry-shaping companies, Green Thumb Industries in cannabis and SoCore Energy in solar, he turned his focus to closing wealth and education gaps in the U.S. Through the Kadens Family Foundation, Pete has launched transformative initiatives like Hope Toledo and Hope Chicago, providing free college and trade school education to underserved students and their families. A lifelong advocate for community empowerment, he has led and supported numerous organizations, earning recognition for his impact. As a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute, Pete continues to drive change, believing that true success is measured by the lives that we lift. Please enjoy this 2-parter with my dear friend, Pete. Hey, y'all. Let's go there. So, Pete, you're a relatively new friend.
Last year or so, yes.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. We were introduced by a mutual friend, and he got it right.
Yeah, he did.
I would say.
He did.
And I was blown away by you. And the reason I wanted to have you on is because one of my aspirations personally is to earn big so that I can live big and give big, you know? And I think that you are a model for that.
Thank you.
But I also think that we share a lot from a heart perspective in terms of where we're coming from. And also, the more I get to know you, it sounds like our upbringings were pretty similar too,
Yep.
and that we've been through a lot of the same things. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the next hour of discourse.
Yeah. Okay. So, Pete, tell us about your upbringing. Tell us about growing up. Tell us about how you became who you are today.
Yeah. I'm a middle income kid from Toledo, Ohio, a Rust Belt economy. Dad was a teacher and mom was an elected official, youngest of 4 kids. I have siblings who are in their 60s, so I'm sort of way down the chain. I was an oops.
Where are you in the birth order? Are you last?
I'm 15 years younger than my twin brothers and 9 years younger than my sister. And so I'm way, way, way down the chain.
Okay, but not baby.
I am the baby.
You're the baby.
I am the baby.
Okay.
I am the baby. Yeah, I'm the youngest.
Okay.
It was a good upbringing. Had some challenges. At times I felt very isolated because my siblings were so much older. And by the time I was in 3rd grade, they were gone. They were in college. So I sort of grew up as an only child in the years where I knew what was actually really going on. And I had some struggles with that. My parents at times were, I would say, a little restrictive. And one of the other things that I didn't understand at the time, but now I do, is they weren't very social with my friends' parents because they were 20 years older than my friends' parents. And so I didn't get this socialization that my kids get where they get to hang out with their friends when I'm hanging out with my friends. Because we're all
like
sort
families
of
hanging out
together.
together.
Families hang out.
Yeah.
We didn't hang out with other families that, that I was connected to. So, I was a leader. And was a good athlete, captain of 3 sports teams, president of my class, sort of did everything right. At some point, it was under the stress and duress of my parents who expected a lot of me. And at other points, it was self-directed. I wanted to be great. But I daydreamed a lot about getting out of that situation. I didn't want to grow up. I didn't want my kids to grow up in the same situation I grew up in. And so I was always, because of my isolation, was always daydreaming about what I could be. And I always really wanted to be, I say this in a matter of fact way, and hopefully people don't think worse of me, but I always wanted to be really rich. And I feel like I manifested that starting from when I was a young kid, because like you, I wanted to give back in big ways. And I had a lot of empathy for people. And the last thing I'll say is, I think I mentioned you, Carla, earlier. When I was 8 years old, my father, who was a professor at a local university, got a chance to travel the world. And we went to 26 countries around the world. And I saw poverty in action. And that's where I opened up the aperture to all the kids who were like me, very similar DNA, just struggling and suffering in ways that were so profound that I couldn't even comprehend as a little kid.
So I want to stop here for a second, because we share so many things. I don't even know where to begin in terms of just the strict upbringing, the isolation from mine. It was immigrant family, so there was a big culture gap between my parents and the rest of the parents. But also, I pulled my kids out of school to travel the world to expose them. We didn't hit 26 countries, but my goal was very much what your dad achieved with you. What did that do specifically for you? And tell me a little bit more about that experience.
Well, I remember, this is now almost 40 years later, but I remember floating down the Klongs in Bangkok, the canals in Bangkok. And I remember this vision of these kids who were my age, 8 years old, and they were playing and laughing in the canals and having the best time. And I'm in a canoe with a tour guide, my family, and these kids were bathing and playing in the same canals that their grandfather was urinating over the banks of the canal, and people defecated, and it was also filled with sewage. They also washed their produce in the same canal, and so. But what I remarked on is these kids looked as happy as I was. And yet I would go to, park pools or country club pools with my friends that were clean and sanitary and safe. And they just didn't know, what the rest of the world was like. And so in their world, they could have fun and play. And it reminded me from a very young age that I didn't need to have things to be happy. And I still live in that principle today. I'm I think by any measure, a very wealthy man. From a bank account perspective, from a relationship perspective, I've never flown private in my life.
Yeah, we were just remarking about that. You have to catch a flight after this podcast. And I was like, am I driving Pete to the hangars? And they were like, no, he's flying American. I was like, go Pete.
I've never flown private in my life. There's a reason for that. I don't want to be exposed to that because I know it can be addictive. I don't have nice cars. I do have a very nice home, but I just have decided that I want to spend my money on experiences with my family and people I love and on community versus on shit that I don't need and never doesn't really make me happy. So, I don't get dressed up. You've never seen me in a button down shirt even. That's not how I roll. And I think a lot of that was from the lessons I learned when I was a kid. You do not need materialistic things to be happy.
Yeah. You do have a good shoe game though.
I do have shoes are something I care about. And that's from my days playing basketball. So,
yeah. Yes. I love that about you. Okay. So, you're starting to tap into your success. So I want to talk about your success. What was your first big win? How did you begin to manifest your wealth? What was it that you actually did?
Well, I talk about often how I, when I was 21 years old, I read a book that changed my life, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And the book is, for those of you who haven't read it, the book is about 7 first-generation billionaires with the names of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, Flagler. And it's about how they went from poverty to extraordinary wealth. I mean, frankly, most of those people would be wealthier than Elon Musk today and meaningfully wealthier than Elon Musk if they were still around. And there was a real discipline and, in fact, in some moments, an obsession with wealth creation. And I don't want to be obsessed with wealth, but at points in my journey, I was. And so I started out with this mindset. I wrote my statement of riches, just like Henry Ford did. And just like Henry Ford, I had it in my briefcase, I had it on my nightstand next to my bed, and I had it in my office at work. And what it stated is that by the time I was 38 years old, I was going to be worth $36,225,000. Here's why. Here's how I'm going to get there. Because, if I wanted to go to the airport now here in Austin, I'm not going to, just put Austin, Texas into the GPS. I'm going to put the Austin airport into the GPS. I need to be specific with my destination in order to build a roadmap to get there. So a very similar discipline that I had from a young age on wealth creation. And I think from a chromosomal perspective, I just am missing the risk chromosome. I just don't see risk the same way other people do. I always tell people, ask me, when you were young, as I started my first business at 24, how could you have done that? And it seems like so much risk for a kid who didn't have that much money, who didn't come from wealth, didn't have a big backstop. And I said, well, actually, I look at risk a little bit differently in the sense that I think the biggest risk is waking up at 40 years old with a spouse and 3 kids and a white picket fence and a ton of liabilities, mortgage, car payments, whatever, and a job that you can't quit because even though you hate the job, but you can't quit because you have all these dependents and all these liabilities. That to me was the biggest risk. Yeah. I didn't want to end up like that. So I decided I was going to take charge of my life. And there was a catalyst. There was a catalytic moment in 9/11 when I lost one of my very best friends in New York. And I was also in New York working on Wall Street at the time.
So sorry, Pete.
No, I mean, I haven't quite had the courage to tell his mother this. But Brad's death was the most catalytic thing in my life.
Let's talk about Brad. Let's honor Brad.
Yeah.
What did Brad mean to you?
He was a fraternity brother of mine at college. He was an amazing athlete. He was authentic. He was kind. He was passionate. he was one of those guys, like, there are a couple people you run into in life and you're like, everyone likes this guy. I mean, there are people, I'm not the most popular creature around. There are people who don't like me for a host of reasons. Brad was one of those people everyone liked and adored. And he was about to get married to another woman who I went to college with and was friendly with. And his life was ripped out from under him. He was on the 89th floor of the second tower. And the thing that I remark about is that Brad liked his job. But that wasn't his end goal, being a trader at a middle market trading firm in New York. He had bigger dreams and aspirations. And so when he died in sort of a very, unusual way, obviously, I kind of made my own decision that Brad at that juncture was not yet the author of his life story. Other people around him in society had written his life story and they were writing mine too. And I decided at 24 years old, I was done with that. Like, I will be the exclusive author of my life story for the rest of my life. And I'm not going to let society or my parents or anyone else tell me what I am supposed to do. I know what I'm supposed to do. It's inside me. And that's when I quit. And I moved to Chicago from New York and I started my first business. And just sort of like, and I say with entrepreneurship, what's the hardest day of any entrepreneur's journey? Day one. But when you break through that seal and you jump off a cliff and you gain your wings on the way down, you're on the path to becoming a successful entrepreneur, even if it doesn't feel like that. So that's how I sort of got there and started my process.
I want to highlight two things in that. One is that this notion of creating your own story, your own reality. Like, I'm not buying into what everybody else is saying or doing. I'm going to do my own. The rebel in me absolutely loves that and is fired up by that. But as a mother, and I know I've said this to you before, you've got to tell Brad's mom. You got to tell her. Like, there's no better way to honor his life and death, quite frankly.
Yeah. You're right. I haven't talked to her in a few years, but I have told this story a number of times on podcasts and other venues like this. And you're right. I do need to call her and tell her. That's important. I do that. I have a sort of an adage that I live by from John C. Maxwell, who is deceased now, but was a famous author on leadership. And he said, the biggest gap in the world is the gap between I should and I did. And most people in this world say I should. I should help a homeless person. I should start a business. I should, do this, that, and the other. And they never do it. And you're right. I've been really, really good about actually just doing things instead of saying I should. So this is one thing I'm going to actually go do.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll do it today.
Oh, that would be so awesome. Yeah. I just got to chill. You're going to have to call me if you do.
I will.
Okay. So you set out to go to Chicago, live life on your terms, launch your first business. What happens from there?
That business was a little bit of a dog. But in entrepreneurship, a very, very successful, now billionaire, friend and partner of mine, and maybe we'll talk about later, was mentoring me at the time. And I'm in my mid 20s and he said, Pete, you think you're trying to hit it. You're trying to go IPO in this thing. The first business I started was an outsourced sales company. I recognized in my early 20s a theme that like everyone in their late 90s, early 2000s was just starting to outsource everything. Manufacturing to contract manufacturers, call centers, HR, payroll, everything was getting outsourced. I noticed though that the one primary function of any business, the most important function of any business was not the revenue generating function, the sales function. And most companies don't sell very well. So I sort of inserted myself and I started a sales outsourcing company. Like I said, it was a dog primarily because I didn't know what I was doing. But my partner, friend Glenn, gave me a good piece of advice. He said, Pete, don't try and hit the home run on this one because it's probably not going to happen. And you don't want you to be let down. He said, the way I see it, and this is, by the way, exactly how it played out. Your first one is going to be a single, maybe rounding to second. Your second venture is going to be a double, maybe rounding to third. And by the time you fucked everything up and failed a million times and learned all you could in the first two ventures, by the time you get to your third venture, you're going to be more wise, more experienced. That's going to be the grand slam. And that is exactly what happened. And I'm glad I was patient enough to see his way of thinking and understand it and know that you don't have to hit home runs right out of the gates, especially not in your 20s. So my first one was a single. I became a millionaire at 29. But not
a bad single.
No, but not much of a millionaire. Yeah. Not like fuck you money where I could just go do whatever I want. But I blew.
Yeah, I call that not now money.
Exactly. I blew enough of it.
Yeah.
And went to Vegas with my buddies and got married and chipped in on my wedding and all. And then my second business was started with that gentleman who I was talking about, Glenn Tolman, and it was a solar energy company. And that was a very successful business. Although I got a little screwed, to be honest with you.
How so?
Because there were some unsavory investors who stuck me behind a 2.5 times distribution preference, which means that for those entrepreneurs out there who are listening, remember, read the section in the operating agreement around distribution preferences. Please. I wish I would have known that when I was 29 or 30, but what the distribution section basically says is this is how the money gets distributed once it's made. And I was like, these people want to invest in me. They're rich. They have big brand names and these people. So I'm going to take their money. All money is green. Turns out that's not the case. One investor in particular was a real dick. And he decided that I didn't deserve to catch up until 2.5 times, which means that all the people who put the money in got 2.5 times their money back first before I caught up and got $1. So instead of making what could have been 40 million, I made 9. Now, again, not a bad outcome.
Yeah. And a good lesson.
But a really good lesson. Read the fine print. When someone tells you you're an entrepreneur, read the operating agreement, get good counsel, spend the extra $1,500 and get a lawyer to advise you. I didn't do that and I missed out. It all ended up working out just fine. Yeah. But that second business SoCore Energy scaled to 20 states. It was a 9-figure revenue business. And then I sold it to a Fortune 500 utility. Do you want me to keep going?
Keep going, but right. I want to call out a point on something you just said. I have seen entrepreneurs make phenomenal personal money and build their personal wealth off failing businesses. And I've seen phenomenal entrepreneurs build amazing businesses and make no money.
Yep.
So that little nugget that you just gave us is so imperative. It's probably the most important negotiation an entrepreneur can make.
You, as an entrepreneur, unless you're independently wealthy, you're going to go out and raise capital, and you do have to look out for yourself. I know the game of entrepreneurship is a team sport, because you got to bring investors in who are on your team. You got to bring colleagues in who believe in your village and believe in your vision. And it's got to be a team sport, but you still have to look out for number one as a founder. And I think enough people out there don't understand that and don't do that. I've been to a couple rodeos now. I know I have to do that. And now as someone on the other side of the table who's negotiating as an investor, sort of the inclination is to give yourself the best terms as the investor. And that means there's an inverse correlation between the investor gets the best terms. That means usually the entrepreneur gets screwed.
Yeah.
And so they have to be real attuned to that.
Yeah. Not to mention the operating team, which stinks.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So now you're in your 30s in this point in the story, in the journey. And this is your third go at it, right? Where you swing big.
So I sold the company, the solar company, to a Fortune 500 utility out of California. And they kept me around running a large division, an unregulated energy division of that company.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Okay, yeah.
And I always like to say that every day consecutively was the worst day of my life, because working in a 25,000 person utility was not my idea. I have my own sort of complex things going on in my brain, but I know one thing that I'm really bad at is accepting authority. I have an authority complex. And so working at a big utility where there's 9 different chains of command and matrix and dotted lines, and, I have to talk to 6 people to meet with the CEO. It's I wasn't feeling that. And more than anything, I feel like my learning was very sort of stymied.
Yeah.
So I got a phone call.
Wait, let's stop for a second. Did that impact how you build and run businesses, having had that experience? Because you've built large businesses. So in effect, people within your organization could have that experience.
Yeah. It reinforced my notion that we're not going to run system heavy, process heavy, bureaucratic businesses. And, sort of the Jeff Bezos theory of, all right, if we're going to try and make a decision here, there are only going to be enough people in the room to eat 2 medium pizzas. Because if there are more people in a room than he could eat 2 medium pizzas, there are too many people, be too many opinions, and we got to get to the heart of the matter here and make decisions. And not everyone needs to be included in every decision. And then Bezos also talks about his ethos around disagree and commit.
Yeah.
Right? It's okay if we disagree, but eventually we're all going to have to commit. It's really, really hard to do in a big company. And it sort of reminded me why I don't want to run a company like a big bureaucratic engine. I want my companies, no matter how big they are, to feel incredibly entrepreneurial in spirit.
Yeah. One of the large companies I worked for, my first meeting was a Zoom call at 7 a.m. The topic was search functionality, and there were 120 people on it.
I bet you didn't get much done, did you?
No. And this was a series of back-to-back meetings that occurred from 7 a.m. till 8 p.m. and rinse and repeat the next day. My first 30 days in, the CEO says, "What are your observations?" And the first thing I say to him is, "I've seen the enemy and it's us." Because there's no way to work.
So many big companies, the unforced errors and footfalls are caused by themselves.
Yeah.
Right. And that's why actually tomorrow I'm going to be back in Chicago and meeting Jim Collins for the first time, the author of Good to Great, a real hero of mine. And this is why he talks about get the right people on the bus, and the leader should be a humble level 5 leader, right? It should, just be a master delegator. Don't feel like you need to lecture everybody in front of 125 people to get buy-in and get reinforcement. Like, let people make decisions. Let them work. This is why you hire talented people. Let them run.
Exactly. Okay. So you're at this company, you get the call. I interrupted you. You get the call. What is the call about?
I get a call from a friend. He wasn't a great friend. He just sort of a peer in the Chicago market who I'd known, who was a pretty renowned philanthropist himself. And he said, "What do you think about marijuana?" Well, I said, "I think marijuana is fucking great." Of course. No, he said, "Not the product, the business of marijuana." Oh, yeah, I dealt a couple sacks of marijuana in college, so I know it could be a little bit lucrative. But I personally have been alcohol sober since I was 29, so going on 17 years now.
I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. And but I always felt I needed a little bit of mind alteration, and so I do love the cannabis plant and always have. The cannabis plant has always been my best way to get to sort of like my homeostasis, and so I said, "Well, I'm interested to learn more." And he said, the then Governor Quinn of Illinois just signed the bill to legalize medical marijuana. If you want to put a team together, I know you had a liquidity event recently. Do you want to put a team together, invest some money in, and try this out? And so I was like, well, it was better than what I was doing working at a 25,000 person utility. So I said, sure. And I just jumped in. And I think that's a hallmark of my entrepreneurial career. I have said, sure, and jumped in both feet first a number of times without good supporting data, without thinking about the ramifications of consequences, without heeding the advice of my family members or friends who said, slow down. When I feel it in my gut, my instincts tell me to do it, I do it. And this is a great example of that. And so his name is Ben Kovler. Ben and I put together a team. We wrote a 45,000 page application. That's not a joke.
45,000?
Yeah.
How long did that take?
It took a better part of 9 months. We hired a bunch of consultants and lawyers and people from Colorado who had already started cannabis businesses. And we understood the game. This is, I would say, like, if there's one reason why I've had a unique degree of success, it's because I spent a lot of time thinking about how other people think. So this was a merit-based process. There were 300 applicants for 20 spots. Keep in mind, 20 licenses in Illinois. There are 12.5 million people. So it was an oligopoly, at a minimum. And so we knew this. We knew that the people who were reading and reviewing our applications were mid-level managers who made like $80,000 at the Department of Agriculture. And the only thing I know they for sure wanted to do was not lose their jobs because they made a poor recommendation to the governor about who was worthy of those licenses. So we knew that length mattered. Sometimes size matters. Size does matter, in fact, yes. And so what we did is we wrote these remarkable, really clean, crisp, and smart 2 to 3 page summaries. Like, I'm thinking we had a product recall plan. What happens if you send a tainted product out into the ecosystem? How do you bring it back? And so we wrote this amazing 2-page executive summary. And then we wrote 120 pages behind it. They were total bullshit, total gibberish, because we knew that the only thing they were going to read was the first 2 pages, and the rest of it, we just said a bunch of things. But we were overly verbose. They would say, well, how could we be wrong for turning down a company that wrote 45,000 pages of text?
How does one submit 40? I know you can't do that digitally. How does one submit 45,000?
Yeah, so I have pictures from September 24th of 2014 with the U-Haul that we drove down to Springfield, the state capital, with 45 bankers' boxes of paperwork.
No way.
Yeah. And so when we won, the new governor came in February 2nd of 2015, and he announced the winners, and we won the state maximum 3 licenses. You couldn't win more than 3 of the 20. We won 3, and then we were kind of off and running. And what we figured out is it was rinse, wash, repeat. Like we could go to every other state using the model we've already used with our IP and just pick every license off. And that's basically exactly what we did.
And the license is to distribute, basically?
The licenses are fully vertically integrated to grow, to process and turn it into product, and then to dispense at retail.
Okay. And then what happened?
So it was a 4.5-year rocket ship ride. We went from a company that had, was worth 0 to a company that was had an enterprise value of $4 billion across those 4.5 years. Went from 0 employees to, before when I left, about 3,000 employees. Company's got about 9,000 employees today. And we went through some tough times. I mean, we still had there was a moment when Jeff Sessions, who was then the Attorney General, seized $120,000 of our cash, because we were not allowed to, the banking system wasn't overly open to us. In certain states, we found banks, their community thrifts that would take our money. But in other states, Nevada being one for whatever reason. I mean, in Nevada, it's like every sin business imaginable, like brothels, casinos, strip clubs, they all have banks. But I think the banks had kind of felt like, their cup had overflowing with sin businesses. So the banks kind of banded together and said, we are not taking any marijuana money, which means that all the money we made in Nevada and mostly Reno and Carson City, we couldn't bank it. So what we had to do is we had to stuff it into a security deposit box at a bank.
That is terrifying.
And then every week, once it got to a certain threshold, like $100,000, $200,000, we had to pack it up in duffel bags with sales receipts and fly it to Chicago. Well, the feds got wind of this.
They thought it was laundering, basically.
Yep. And one day, 2 of our employees, who were trusted employees, 2 duffel bags, each with $60,000 a piece in it. And they flew from Reno to Midway, Chicago Midway. And as soon as they got off the plane in Midway, they got jacked. The DEA pulled them, detained them, stole our money. It was $120,000. If everyone wants to question, does government work? It works in part for them, because we had $120,000 in counted bills and sales receipts. And 3 weeks later, we got a notice of seizure from the federal government saying that we had the right to appeal our seizure of $67,000. We're like, what happened to the other $53,000? We did not end up appealing under the advice of the then state's attorney. And, but so there's lots of drama. But I will tell you this, wherever I went, I loved this so much. Wherever I went, I was a celebrity. People wanted to talk to the guy who was breaking the norm, breaking the mold, doing something different. And so we would host these career fairs in places like Toledo, Ohio, my hometown, Erie, Pennsylvania, Danville, Pennsylvania, Holyoke, Massachusetts, hard-hit towns where we went to locate our facilities primarily. And thousands of people would show up. We were like a new source of energy in that community, a new business, something they could have hope for after years of sort of textile and industrial industries just going away. And so thousands of people would show up, and they would want to hear what we were up to and the jobs we were creating. They wanted to be a part of our movement. That to me was a very connected moment for me in the time of building Green Thumb Industries. So long story short, the company was super successful because of 2 things. One, we went after the non-obvious consumer. Every other competitor went after the traditional consumer. 80% of the consumer market when we started, it was males. Males were the one using cannabis. We decided to go after the non-obvious consumer, the female aged 30 to 50 who was drinking that glass of wine at the end of a long day after catering to a couple kids and maybe even having a full-time job. We wanted to convert her from a glass of wine, which, by the way, was going to make her hungover.
And not sleep,
to a gummy. And if we could do that, by the way, American females aged 30 to 50 drive more consumer behavior in this world than any other demographic in the world. And we knew that. So we went after the non-obvious consumer, and we built all of our consumer packaged goods catering to women and branded towards women. And we sold, instead of selling weed, we sold experiences, rest, love, sex, study, focus. That's how we sold our brands. because we knew that women didn't care about the name of or the strain. What they wanted is this experience. The effect.
Yeah.
The other thing we did really well, and then I'll shut up on this one, is we did the unsexy well. While everyone was busy trying to create the next Apple store of weed or the next Starbucks of weed and Venice Beach or in South Beach or in the Las Vegas Strip, we were going to the places that have been flyover country for years. Erie, Pennsylvania, Holyoke, Massachusetts, Carson City, Nevada. These people love weed too. And no one ever came to their town. So whenever we went to those smaller communities that were struggling a little bit, we had a monopoly. And therefore, we were then, and we are still today, the most profitable cannabis company in the world.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I find people always have a tendency to go for the bigger market, not realizing the white space is actually in the smaller market and is a lot less crowded.
Yeah.
And it's easy.
Your operating expenses are lower.
Totally.
Because, labor's cheaper, your CapEx is cheaper because it costs you less to build. I hate to say it, but in many cases, there's not unions in some of these smaller communities. So it helps from a labor perspective.
Totally. Okay. So you took this company public.
Yeah. June 10th of 2018, took the company public. The first green arrow went up. And that was when I officially knew that I was rich in at least one way.
Okay. So what does rich mean? And what do you mean at least one way?
Well, I thought rich meant that you had lots of dollars in your bank account and you had flexibility to do whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted, and travel the world and have magical experiences and buy a beautiful home. And that is a permutation of rich. But what I was lacking in that moment, as I've told you before, Carla, is I felt very bank account rich and juxtaposed because I also at that moment felt very relationship poor. In the process of building that company into the rocket ship that it was over 4.5 years, I'd sort of abandoned my family, my wife and 3 kids, my elderly parents, my siblings, my friends from college, just didn't have time for them. So I wasn't intentional. I wasn't trying to be a jerk. I wasn't being a bad friend. I wasn't being disloyal or anything. I was absent from those relationships. And when you wake up and you have a lot of money and then you got no one to share it with because no one gives a shit about you because you haven't returned their call in 2 years, it's a little bit of a wake up call. And I had that first, I would say, most people are like, they're floating on high for years and relishing all the money they have and all the cool things they could do. I would say the first 6 months after I retired, which is shortly after my IPO, were the worst 6 months of my life.
What happened?
I felt identityless. And if I did have an identity, I felt it was people were seeing me as some rich dude. Like my identity was not, my identity used to be, I was a great CEO. I was a great entrepreneur. I was a risk taker. I was an intellect. I got people to coalesce around my vision. I was an influencer in my community. And then this happened and I retired and all I was some rich dude. I was like dumb money. I was like an ATM machine and everyone was just coming to me for handouts. And frankly, they still do, but I have much better control and much better boundaries today than I did 5-6 years ago when this all went down. So it was a struggle for me to figure out what is my identity, what is my purpose. I did the thing that I set out to do and then 10X'd it, frankly, from the Think and Grow Rich perspective. So now I'm 40 years old. Now what? And other than certainly being around and coaching my kids, which I do and I continue to do, but I felt identityless, and that was a real struggle for me. For a guy who's always had a CEO identity for the last 20 years of my life, that was hard.
Yeah. There's real grief in it. What?
Grief from losing what gave me my identity, but also, I know you and I have talked a little bit about this, Carla. I had a shit ton of PTSD.
Oh, yes. I didn't know. So say more about this.
Well, look, here's the truth. I hate to say this because I'm sure there's an example of someone out there who, probably, could debunk my thesis here. But you don't create the type of wealth I created by being the best person all the time. There are moments where you have to be ruthless. There are moments where I was a jerk. There are moments where I was looking out for myself and exclusively myself. I had to fire, I think about the hundreds of people who I fired and the looks in their eyes and the tears and the notion that, that their families were going to suffer. And these people weren't bad people. Maybe they didn't do a good job or maybe they weren't working effectively, but I was negatively impacting their life. And I feel, and there are still people out there who, even though I had to do the right thing for my company and I had to terminate them, I run into them from time to time in and around Chicago, and I'm sure they don't think overly fondly of me. And it worries me. Like sometimes I'm looking around my back and with my kids and, is there going to be someone over here who sort of left the company in a somewhat messy way and hates me and comes up and starts, berating me in front of my kids? I worry about that. And I have PTSD from some of the more ruthless things I did to create my wealth.
Yeah. I can relate to that.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you can. You were a big corporate executive.
Totally. I mean, I'm not proud of the fact that I've laid off thousands of people, right? It became a core competency and learning how to deal with it and separate myself. It's part of what started the disconnection from my heart. I had to make it through it.
Well, and think about, in this era of CEOs, there's going to be a lot more PTSD because the displacement that happens as a result of AI. I mean, we're going to be displacing perfectly credible and capable people who are hard working class people. And we're going to be displacing them because of AI. That is going to create a whole new wave of PTSD for today's CEOs.
Yeah. I also am an optimist, though, and we can come back to this in a second, and that I feel like it's also going to every problem creates an opportunity, and it's going to create abundance on the other side. But we can talk about that in a second. I want to talk about...
also one other thing real quick, which is just like, it takes two to tango, right? And there was whenever I failed someone, even as, lazy as they may have been, or as few KPIs as they hit, it was in part my fault too. And I think coming to grips with the notion that, I was at fault because I hired wrong. I assessed them wrong. I put them in the wrong position. I set them up to fail. Like, I think that hurt too, that it was always in part my fault when someone didn't work out.
That's the coach in you. The basketball coach. So, okay. So I want to talk about what you did. Okay. You're grieving. You're suffering from PTSD. You have a total loss of identity. You don't like the man that you had to be to get there.
Not at all.
So what did you do? How did you reconnect to your family and how did you become who you are now?
Well, I always had an anthropological fascination with poverty. I'd been the chairman of the board of the largest homeless agency in Chicago for about 10 years while I was doing these other things. And I understood that misfortune played no favorites in this life, and that bothered me. And I knew I wanted to do something in the philanthropic realm, especially with my new found treasure. And, but I wanted to take some time off, and I felt like I knew when it would be the right time for me to jump back in. And again, I took those first few months and grieved and hung with my kids and played with them. And I'm sitting at the luxurious pool at the Ritz-Carlton in Naples, Florida. And we were staying there. I got us a suite, one of those $10,000 a night things, and this big suite. And we were staying there for 2 weeks in December. And I didn't have a job anymore, and my kids weren't in school yet. So it's like, fuck it, let's go do it. And after about 5 days of that, just sitting by the pool and in the laps of luxury, I started getting really bored. And I started thinking about, all right, this can't possibly be the rest of my life. Now, sometimes I kind of fantasize about maybe I should just move to Turks and Caicos and I'll just like walk the beach every day and play tennis and smoke a joint. But I was already getting tired of it 5 days in. And it's when I had this epiphany that if I want to change the world in ways big and small, I need to get proximate. This is about the time I got accepted in the Henry Crown Fellowship at the Aspen Institute as well, which also was a life-changing moment. But I had to get proximate, and I had to really understand what help people needed, because there's nothing worse than what I call the white messiah, sort of the rich white person who goes into underserved communities thinking they know what they need. And so that was at the pool that day is when I decided, you know what, I want to teach. And so I reached out to I knew I couldn't teach within the Chicago public school systems. It's unionized. There were too many rules around that. So I reached out to a friend of mine, who's also an Aspen Institute fellow, by the way. And she ran the largest urban charter school system in America called Noble Schools out of Chicago. She had 17,000 students alone in Chicago. And I said, is there any way I could teach about entrepreneurship? Just like a seminar, 2 days a week. And she found a way for me to do that. And she sent me to the hardest hit, most violent zip code in the state of Illinois called Englewood. Amazing, beautiful people, but really, really tragic what's happening there. I was the only white person in the school, including faculty and staff. So I was definitely a fish out of water, and I definitely felt vulnerable and uncomfortable. But for the better part of that year, which was the COVID year, fall of 19 into 20, March of 2020, I taught 2 days a week, seminar 2 days a week in that school. And that was sort of what propelled me. Once I got into the classroom, saw what was capable with these kids, understood what their problems were and maybe how I could fix it, that's when I started regaining my identity.
Okay. So what did you do about it?
So what I learned is that some of these kids were really smart, really capable, but they had too many obstacles, primarily financial obstacles, but certainly emotional and trauma obstacles and whatnot. But more than that, what I learned is that they were really one generation anomalies. They were actually not going to help our community or their community sort of reinvent itself. And the reason is because the community that they grew up in was not sort of proud of their scholastic achievement. Life is very Darwinian in Englewood. It's about survival. And so when I'm worried about how to put food on the table or pay the rent check, the lighting bill, I can't possibly be worried about what my grades are and going to college. I got other very rudimentary stuff, Maslow's hierarchy of needs stuff to worry about, right? And so what would happen is we'd send these kids off to college. And on the first day, I asked my first class of 21 kids, again, all Black, all below the poverty line. I said, how many of you have been impacted by gun violence? Of 14 of the 21 raised their hands. If you asked that same question in my public school system where I live, it would be 0 of 21. And they were 11 miles apart. And then I asked the question, how many of you intend to come back? Most of the kids who qualify for my class were college going kids. So how many of you intend to come back to Chicago or even more proximate, Englewood, the neighborhood you live in after Columbus, after college? And only 2 of the 21 raised their hands, which was the light bulb moment. We are literally catalyzing the brain drain in this community. Here are these amazing, untapped, kids of color who are going to go off and get educated, and they will never come back to this community, and we will never benefit from them and their intellect. And the reason is because they would go off to college and they would come home and they would feel badly about going to college. They were made to feel badly about going to college. They weren't celebrated for that. Their scholastic aptitude meant nothing to many of their family members. So it's when I realized that in order to change cultures, in order to change communities, it's got to be a family-based approach. It cannot be one kid, one generation. That's when I decided that I was going to create a platform, the first time ever, that sent 2 generations from the same family to college or trade school together. And no one's ever done it before. And I had this thesis, I bet the data will show that when kids and parents are getting schooled and educated at the same times, outcomes are way better. Turns out I was right. And so I went to my hometown in Toledo, Ohio, and I offered 500 all Black, all below the poverty line kids who grew up 4.5 miles from where I grew up, the chance to go to college for free, as well as their parents. And that's how I got started in the philanthropy game. And then I sort of kept taking it to the next level.
That's amazing. And how long has the program been running, Pete? Remind me.
We had our first cohort graduate as seniors in college last year. So we're 5 years in on the program in Ohio and 3 years in the program in Chicago. Collectively, we'll send about 30,000 underserved minorities and their family members to college or trade school for free.
30,000.
30,000 is a lot.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And then what are you learning? So now that you're several years in, what are you learning?
Wow. I mean, what's interesting is I always say they've taught me more than I've taught them. And so I'm learning a lot. I'm learning that reinforcement that misfortune plays no favorites. Many of these kids and these families did absolutely nothing wrong. They lost the zip code lottery. They lost the birth lottery. They lost the education lottery. I felt like I won all those things. The schools they went to were underserved, don't have the types of resources. And so they were sort of screwed from the get-go. I feel like I learned to be a better listener. And I had to learn to listen in different languages. Sort of like the language I speak with my buddies is different than the language that, my Hope scholars speak on the south and west sides of Chicago. Their language is a little bit more substantive, frankly. They talk about things that really matter. When I go to my country club, I really despise talking about people's golf games or their pickleball game. That's not how I want to engage. Yeah, small talk is a killer. Right. So one of the things I learned is I really enjoy spending time with these kids and these families because when we talk about important shit. because that's all they have the capacity to talk about in many cases. I learned something really interesting, that appreciation is a learned skill. You would think that, I go on, I give this massive amount of money. I'm, $50 million into these different platforms charitably. And you would think that they would be hugging you and loving you and appreciating you and thank you and sending you emails every day. And there was some of that for sure. There were definitely a cadre of people who were very appreciative. But for the most part, that's not the way it ended up working out. And that's okay. And I've learned that you can't expect of others what you expect of yourself. You'll always be let down. But also, my parents taught me to say thank you. And frankly, I had things to be thankful for. So it was a learned skill. I grew up in my home having to say please and thank you. And these kids, because frankly, their lives were so challenging and so Darwinian, they didn't really have much to be appreciative or thankful for, and they never learned that skill.
Yeah, you were getting them to baseline.
Right.
Just basic human needs.
100%. It was really hard for them to say thank you. It was like delivering bad news to a boyfriend or girlfriend. Just come up to me and say thank you. And that was a big learning for me. And so I learned to sort of dial back my expectations. People don't need to overtly thank me for me to feel reinforced and validated. And that's been a lesson for me.
So did it change your motivation? Meaning, like, did you set out to feel that sense of gratitude and then have to adapt?
I think I did. I think I definitely wanted that reinforcement and that gratitude. And I wanted this platform to make me a well-known entrepreneur. A well-known philanthropreneur, which is a combination of philanthropy and entrepreneur. I wanted fame and notoriety associated with this.
Yeah.
And I got it.
Yeah.
But there was some collateral damage associated with that as well. So I got most of what I wanted. I wish I would have gotten more gratitude, but in the end, I think actually in some ways the lack of gratitude was a little humbling. And maybe I needed a little bit of that humble pie.
Are you familiar with the hungry ghost?
No.
In the Buddhist faith, there's something called the hungry ghost. And it's basically our ego's need for validation. And the way they depict the hungry ghost is basically like a skeleton that's like completely emaciated. It doesn't matter how much you feed the ghost. In fact, the more you feed the ghost, the thinner and thinner it gets. And so there's no way that's the hungry ghost. Yeah. There's no way to feed the hungry ghost. It'll never be satiated. And the more we seek validation, which, oh, by the way, for people who have operated at high levels and been visible, that's a thing. Validation is a thing.
It's 100% a thing.
It's one of the few ways that we get recognition.
Yeah.
So
it is. And I learned too that I was beginning to weaponize my wealth.
Oh, say more about that.
Just like when you're rich, you can get away with a lot of shit. And you can work people to your favor, and you can get people to do what you want because they need your money, and you know that. I tried to weaponize my wealth, and
oh shit, Pete.
Yeah, and it was. I've weaponized my wealth with family members to get what I want with them. I've weaponized my wealth with friends. I've certainly weaponized my wealth in my charitable stuff. It's like, hey, I'm on a nonprofit board and we want to do this and I want to do something different. And so instead of, sort of disagreeing and committing, I've said, hey, I'll tell you what, I want to do something different. So I'm just going to pay for it. And then the whole board says, oh, if we already have a funder, then we're going to do what Pete wants to do instead of what the rest of the board wants to do. So I'm not proud of that. But there's enough sort of self-awareness for me to acknowledge that that's something I'm working on. Like, I don't want to weaponize my wealth, and I have done that.
Yeah. I appreciate your candor so much. I was listening to another podcast you did, and the host played the game of this or that with you. And he said, this or that, money or love. And you took the longest ass pause. I was like, oh my God, love, Pete, love. And you just took the longest pause. And then you said, there have been times where it has been money and there have been times when it has been love. Where are you in that now? If I said this or that, money or love, what would you say?
I mean, I would definitely say love, but I gotta be honest with you, I fucking like making money. And this part of my journey, it's sort of more about impact, but also like, look, I took a lot of my money and I deployed it.
Yeah.
And so,
you're spending it, you're giving it.
I am. I'm spending it, I'm giving away, I'm investing it. And so I feel kind of poor right now. and I know that's not people are probably going to think I'm a jerk for saying that, but like, I'm really less liquid than I have ever been because I deployed capital and haven't harvested a lot of gains yet for my deployed investments. And so now I love, and I want that by all means. Relationships mean everything to me. But I also really like making money, and I'm also back on that train and focused on that.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about Fellow, your latest venture, which is super cool. And one of the cool things about you is you keep changing industries.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so now you're a tech guy.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
I remark to people who come up to me and seek counsel, and they show me their resume, and I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to do this, that, or the other. I say, well, and then they'll say, well, I have 30 years of experience. And I say, well, I read your resume, and can I kind of be a dick? Because to me, it looks like you have 1 year of experience repeated 30 times. Oh. And I hate to say that to people, but if you're not curious, if you're not trying other things, if you're not getting vulnerable and insecure, you're not gaining the experience you need to be a really well-rounded business person or entrepreneur. So yeah, I've done outsourced sales. I've done marijuana. I've done funeral homes. I've done, I own a building on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. I own a structural and civil engineering company out of Philadelphia. I like the different touch points I have because I'm always learning. And to me, that's as interesting as the money. Like the learning piece of it is as interesting as the money.
Yeah. And then, so tell us about Fellow. What are you setting out to solve now?
Yeah. So I had a buddy who has been through rehab and has struggled through with addiction. And I, his name is Jeff. And I probably love Jeff as much as any human on the face of the earth. He's hilarious. He's kind. He's smart. We don't agree on politics, but that's okay. We work through that. And he finally, after, so many years, overcame his addiction. And he's been harping on me to like, dude, I want to tap into your entrepreneurial savvy and start something that really that really initiates the process of real treatment. Because look, 80% of people in this country who have an addiction go into inpatient treatment, and within 2 years, they end up either dead or back in treatment again. It doesn't work, right? And, or it works, but it doesn't work for enough people. And so he keeps saying this to me. We need to do this. It's a big problem. And one day I read an article about Blue Cross Blue Shield in Minnesota. And this is going on a year and a half ago. And they had said that there were too few therapists in Minnesota for them to rely exclusively on therapists. They had too many people who were dealing with mental health issues. So they were going to start paying out full claims to qualified peers who didn't have degrees, but who had been through some challenges. And if they were willing to provide certified peer support, Blue Cross Blue Shield would pay out full claims. That was a light bulb moment for me. I was like, holy shit, this thing Jeff's been telling me all along about treatment and how we need to come up with a new form of treatment. That's it. Like, we need to bring in subclinical folks, amateurs. If you think about it, like CPR is a great example. There are 11 million people who are alive today because in 1972, the American Heart Association said, you know what? There are too few paramedics. On average, in an urban setting, they're 9 minutes away from getting to someone in distress. In 9 minutes in a cardiovascular event, someone's likely dead. And so we need to arm amateurs who are just in grocery stores and libraries and malls with the capacity to provide CPR. First time it's ever been done, 1972. And that changed the course of history for many people because now there's lots of volunteers. Of course, would I rather have, if I was in cardiovascular distress, would I rather have a paramedic or a doctor, using CPR on me? Of course.
Yeah, but sometimes speed is the winner.
But if there's someone in there who's trained in it and they don't have two letters in front of their name, I don't give a shit. Go at it. And so that's when I started thinking about, like, I've always been a big believer in sort of history rhymes. And I think history rhymes here too. When we get into medical crises, healthcare crises, as we are right now, we just are so understaffed across the board in terms of doctors, therapists, clinicians. We get to a point of an actual inflection moment where there's a crisis. We have leaned on amateurs. And so Fellow is all about leaning on these amateurs who have met challenges, a substance abuse challenge, an alcohol-related challenge, a mental health challenge, could be a fitness challenge. But there's millions of people out there who've overcome something big. And I would argue that their counsel and support and guidance is as helpful in many cases as that of traditional trained therapists. And so what I said to my partner is, hey, if you can monetize your car via Uber and you can monetize your dwelling via Airbnb, why can't you monetize something that arguably is way more societally valuable? Your story, your experiences that other people can benefit from. And by the way, your life story, your life experience, that's ubiquitous. You don't have to invest in a car to have that. You don't have to own a property to be able to monetize that. You just have to have something that is free, a life experience, a life story. And so I went out and found a woman who I said, I'm going to find one of the best people from Uber. And I found this woman, Alyssa Pollack, who built and created Uber Eats, took it from 0 to 15 billion.
She's amazing, by the way.
She is. Thank you. And we started this. I told her, I said, Alyssa, I want you to build me the biggest marketplace of people who can provide good counsel and advice because of something they've been through with people who are looking for that counsel and advice. And we have to do it in a really affordable, effective, efficient manner. So that's what Fellow is. It's a platform similar to Uber that pairs people together who have met a challenge with people who are currently enduring, that challenge. And our fellows get paid $56 an hour. So there's a real monetization opportunity for their life story.
Yeah, it's so cool, Pete. It's so cool. And, I just love this notion that you can monetize your life experience. It's like a whole new marketplace for people, right? And it's the most valuable thing you have to bring to bear, to your point.
I think it's going to be the biggest business. And keep in mind, my businesses are now collectively worth $8 billion. I think this is going to be the biggest business I've ever built, because it just taps into something so human, so needed, such a pain point. And if you look at sort of like, I said this earlier today, Carla, but if you take all the therapists, social workers, clinicians who work on mental health related matters in this country, and you said every single one of them was going to work a fully scheduled 50-hour week, still, only 1 in 9 of our fellow American citizens who are struggling through a mental health or addiction issue could ever be seen. That means 8 in 9 Americans will be left alone to fight a challenge that we know is almost impossible to fight alone.
Yeah.
We can't let that happen.
It's terrifying. Not to mention, if I personally was struggling with something, it would be a lot more valuable for me to talk to someone who's actually overcome it versus someone who's studied it.
Right.
And that's no knock on someone who's certified.
Yeah.
It's just a function of reality. Like, I want to know who's actually done the work.
And is there something to say about having that discourse in a very open and honest way with someone who is totally anonymous and who you don't know? I still remember probably the deepest conversation I've ever had is on the flight from Cancun back to Chicago with this woman who was a yogi. And I don't even think I remember her name, but we sat there for 3.5 hours on that flight. I actually looked her up. We had no LinkedIn connections in common. So it was perfect. And I felt she was just so warm and inviting and nice and had such good counsel. I spilled my guts. I told her shit I never even told my wife.
Wow.
But it led me to believe that anonymity in a relationship, that notion that I'm not going to run into this person at a grocery store. Yeah. I don't need to be embarrassed to say my deepest, darkest things to them. But the truth is that when we get the best help, it's when we're most vulnerable. And so I think there's a lot of power in not knowing the people on the other end of the line in our platform.
Wow. I had a similar experience. I had the inverse. On a flight, somebody completely opened up to me about the fact that they were...
You're a very inviting person.
Oh, thank you. Same sort of thing. He opened up to me about his alcoholism, and his kids had just cut him off. And his wife said, hey, I'll be here on the other side, but you got to get yourself sorted. Yeah. And he was flying himself to a ski town to go ski because that was the only thing that he could do and not drink. And it was a super powerful moment. And we knew we'd never see each other again. And upon leaving, I was like, you're going to do this. You're going to be fine. So yeah, I've had that same experience. And it was very, very powerful and very connected. Pete, you and I have talked about the fact that human connection is probably the most important thing that we could focus on the next decade during the rise of AI. It's something that I'm grateful that you're focusing on and putting your time and treasure towards. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing in the community that you live. I'm grateful for the fact that you've showed up for me already at a dinner that I hosted that I was nervous about, and encouraged all of us to be proximate in our own backyard. The dinner was about Palestine and Israel. And what ended up happening was you challenged us to focus on Austin, which was very, very powerful. Yeah. So we have so much to talk about. Here's what I'm going to suggest if you're open to it. I want to invite you back. We're going to do it remote. And what we're going to talk about is all that. Plus, we're going to talk about your wellness, because you are a beast in the gym. You take such awesome care of yourself. This is a value that you and I share. You mentioned that you've been sober. I want to talk about this and what that means as part of your journey and your wellness. So I'm going to put a pin in here, and this is going to be part 1 of
Let's
2 if you're open to it.
We're going to go back Peter Attia style, Andrew Huberman style. We're going to talk about
Totally.
health. Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. That's great.
Yeah.
I never thought anyone, so 3 years ago, I was 30 pounds overweight.
Yeah, I did not know this.
Yeah,
we totally have to, this is a whole story
if
in and
you
of
had
itself.
known me before, you would be like, people saw me today who hadn't seen me in a couple of years. Jenny from Jenny's Ice Cream.
Yeah.
And didn't recognize me.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. So for those of you that are listening and not watching, Pete is totally shredded, in phenomenal shape. And I've also been witness to one of his workouts through somebody else who said they might never work out with Pete ever again, who's also like crazy fit. So we're definitely going to talk about this and everything you're doing to keep yourself well and healthy.
Great. Can't wait.
Okay.
Thank you, Carla. This is awesome.
Part 1 of 2.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank y'all for listening today. If you're so inclined, please follow, subscribe, download, share, all of the things so that we can keep going. We appreciate your support so much. If you're interested in learning more, go to thecoeffect.co.